Everybody for being here, and thank you for the Natural History Institute for hosting me. So I am obviously going to be presenting about honeybee natural history and conservation. So I'm going to start with kind of a little crash course on honeybees and what they are, why we're interested in them, and how exactly the colony works. And then we're going to move into kind of what's happening with them, why they're in danger or declining, and what we can do to help that out. And then I'm going to jump into my research and let you know kind of what's happening in the scientific field today. So just to introduce myself, I'm Twombly Ellis, like Bob said. I go to Cornell University, where I am a senior insect biology major, climate change minor, and I work in Professor Seeley's lab, which has done consistently amazing behavioral studies, so I'm really interested in honeybee behavior. So I'm going to talk about first why honeybees are important, why we care. So honeybees are super important because they're pollinators. They pollinate 70% of our fruits and vegetables that we as a society eat, and 1/3 of your food in general. So you'd be out 1/3 of everything you eat on an everyday basis without honeybees. And then in terms of like the world population, they pollinate about 90% of the world's nutrition. So they're pretty important. We really care about them. And without them, we'd be at a loss for food and providing for everybody. One popular misconception that I've kind of heard off and on is that honeybees are not native to the United States and thus are causing other native bee species to decline. And I can address this just really quickly because I think it's important that everybody knows that this is not true, because monoculture agriculture, like we have here in the United States, is also not native to the United States and needs some sort of pollination service in order to provide for us. So the almond bloom in California that covers many hundreds of thousands of acres wouldn't be able to be pollinated with native bees on their own. So, and while honeybees are non-native, they are not invasive, so they're not putting any other bees out of food or habitat. So they're really important in today's kind of economy and how we consume food. And then also, obviously, they make honey, they make wax, and we all love those kinds of things. So they're really important to have around, and we want to keep them here and healthy. So next, I'm going to talk about just the kind of colony setup, how bees work, what happens in the hive. So to start with, I think it's important to note that there's a queen in a colony that is the only reproductive female in the entire colony, and so she lays all the eggs. She's the only way that the colony can reproduce, and that most of the eggs she lays are worker bees, and the worker bees are all female bees. So unlike the bee movie, the worker bees do all the work and they're all females, and then the drone bees, these ones, have a little bit bigger abdomen and they don't sting, so they're kind of fun. You can pick them up and they buzz around in your hand. They're really not dangerous, and their only purpose is to mate with the queen to provide fertilization for the worker bee eggs. And so the drones are produced in the summer months, and then they are killed off at the end of the summer and kicked out of the hive because they are a waste of colony resources at that point. So if you walk around kind of in September, you can see piles of drones in front of colonies, which is kind of sad. And then I want to talk about kind of the colony setup, the hive, the managed hive that you see commercial beekeepers using, any other beekeeper. So it's made up of supers. These boxes are called supers, and inside there are frames, and you normally have 8 to 10 frames per super. And the way it works is your colony will grow in the spring. So you start out with a super for brood and maybe a super for honey, and it can grow depending on how well your bees are doing and kind of what's happening. The honey super is always at the top, and this is true for colonies in cavities and trees and rocks as well. They always store their honey in the top of the colony. And if you have a queen excluder, which is seen here, that can keep the queen in the lower part so she can just lay eggs and not get to the honey. And commercial beekeepers like to do this because then you can just take the honey off the top and extract it all. And you don't have to worry about killing the queen. So over here we just have a quick demonstration of, this is a honey frame, so it's just full of honey, capped honey. And then down here, this is a brood frame. And the interesting thing about bees is they are holometabolous insects, so they pupate. Another example of this would be butterflies. There's a caterpillar form, and then they form a chrysalis, and then they emerge as a butterfly. So the same is kind of true of bees. They start as a larval form, and then when they're ready to pupate into a bee, their cell is capped, and they pupate, and then they emerge as an adult bee. So this right here is a frame of pupating bees. It's all capped brood, and then around the side you can see pollen stores. And then just as a point of reference, this is a queen cell. So when the queens are raised, they're not raised in little cells like this. They're raised, they look like peanuts. So that's kind of fun. So this is just like I just said, the honeybee larval life cycle. So they get laid as an egg by the queen here. They're a larva, and they get fed bee bread, which is made of nectar and pollen, and then they grow into a larger larva, and then they pupate. Their cell is capped with wax. They pupate into an adult bee, and then they emerge as an adult bee. An interesting thing is just kind of how long it takes for them to pupate. The worker bees will take 21 days. Then the drones will take even longer, which is kind of important for some parasites that pupate or that feed on pupating bees. And then the queen takes a really short period of time, presumably because if you lose a queen in a colony, you want to requeen really fast. Yeah. So now I want to touch on Eusociality, because this is what makes bees really cool. This is why I love them and why they're easy to keep, easy to provide pollination services. So in order to be eusocial, insects have to have one reproductive female, and then they have overlapping of generations. And so what happens is that these bees are raised, they pupate, and they emerge as adult bees, and then they have this temporal segregation of tasks. So as soon as they pupate, it's not like the bee movie where, you know, they get to choose what job they do. They kind of have this job segments that they like cycle through their life. And so immediately after they pupate, they kind of come out of the comb and they start cleaning out their cell. So they make sure their cell is nice and clean for the next egg. And then they start cleaning the comb around them. Their first job in the colony is just to clean out cells. And then as they start to develop a little bit, because newly emerged bees don't have developed wings or stingers, so they can't immediately fly. So they're kind of working in the colony and like developing those things a little bit more. And one of the things that they need to develop is their hypopharyngeal glands, which they use to make the bee bread and the royal jelly that they feed to the larva. And so once they develop those glands, they can nurse the bees and they can feed the little larvae, which you can see in these cells here. And so once they do that, and once they've gone through that life stage, after about a week, they kind of move towards the outside of the colony. So what happens is they start inside, and they just kind of start moving towards the outside. So at 1 week, they kind of start receiving food from the foragers. They kind of sit there, and when the foragers come in, they take the food from them, and then they go store it in themselves so that the hive works well. And then at about 2 weeks, they kind of move towards the outside of the hive again to be guard bees or to be undertaker bees that kind of remove the dead corpses from the hive and push them out onto the ground so that the hive stays clean. And they also fan the hive because keeping the temperature steady in the hive is really, really important to honeybee development. So these bees can stand outside and fan it and regulate the temperature because they're moving towards foraging, but they're not quite there yet. Some of them will do orientation flights to start to practice being a bee. And then after 3 weeks, they finally get to forage. They finally get to move outside of the colony and do what we all think of bees as doing. So they forage for nectar, pollen, and water. Water is again important for the temperature regulation because it can provide evaporative cooling. And then the pollen and nectar for honey and bee bread, and all that kind of stuff. And one thing I like to say is just that in the bee movie, you've got these like big bee men coming in as foragers, and really these are little grandma bees who fly out there to do all the foraging. And they typically die in the field, which is nice for all the undertaker bees, so we don't have to take all the corpses out. Now, eusociality also is super cool because bees can communicate, and they communicate via dance. They also communicate via hormone or pheromones, which the queen can give off to let the colony know how it's doing, how the queen's doing. Alarm pheromones, which let the colony know kind of, you know, if there's something attacking them. But the really cool thing is their dances. Carl von Frisch figured this out. He won a Nobel Prize for it. So what happens is this is kind of complicated. So the bees will, foragers will go out and find a really good nectar source. And once they find this source, they want to tell everybody else in the hive that they found it, that all the rest of the bees should go exploit it. So this diagram here shows this is a bee foraging, and it's foraging a flower that's 90 degrees away from the sun. And so how do you communicate that when you go into a dark hive where your frames are vertically oriented, right? So you go into the hive, and how they do this is they use the up direction on their comb to indicate the sun. So if they went outside and their floral resource was directly towards the sun, then they would dance directly towards the top of the colony to indicate that once the bees emerge from the hive, they should go towards the sun to find the flowers. So this is the same, any angle. So this bee here is going at a 90-degree angle to the sun. So once it gets inside the hive, it goes at a 90-degree angle to vertical to indicate the direction that the bees should head when they get out of the hive. The fun thing about this dance is it doesn't just indicate direction, it also can indicate the quality of the resource as well as how far away it is. So the bees will come in and they basically a waggle dance. Bear with me. It's kind of like they waggle and then they go around. And then they keep doing that in both directions for a while. And so how long they waggle indicates how far away the resource is. So if they waggle for 1 second, it's a kilometer away, 2 seconds, 2 kilometers. So all the bees can know how far to travel. And then also how excited they are when they waggle indicates how good the floral resource is. So if they're really, really excited, all the bees will know that they need to go get the resource. And then if they're like, I'll do a couple circles, they're like, okay, we don't need to go to that one. So yeah, it's really cool. There's also a couple of other dances that are less intricate than these. There's kind of the wake up dance that all the bees roll around to the foragers and they shake them to wake them up. And then there's also a dance, like a headbutt dance. I guess it's not a dance, it's just a headbutt that bees will do when they stop foraging. We need to store all the honey, and they'll just go up and headbutt all the foragers and stop them from dancing. So they're kind of cool. They're really fun to watch. Yeah. So now this is really kind of confusing, so bear with me. This is the really cool part about eusociality, because evolutionarily, all of us are evolved, and all animals, mammals, are evolved to want to reproduce, to want to forward our genetics in the gene pool. But bees don't do that, because bees are a part of a big colony, and so the individual worker bees can't reproduce. And so this is kind of why these individual worker bees don't want to reproduce. So it's kind of a genetic thing. It is a genetic thing. Where it's haplodiploidy. Gosh, okay, so the queen is a diploid organism, so she has 2 gametes, and the drones are haploid. So the queen will produce, right here we have 4 different eggs, or gametes, I guess, and then the drone produces these 2 sperms to fertilize these eggs. But the queen can decide whether she wants male or female babies, or eggs, I guess, and in order to have females, you have to have a fertilized egg, but in order to have males, you don't. So she can decide to lay a male egg, which only has 1 gamete here, or a female which has 2. And because of this and the way that it works, the sisters end up being 75% related to each other, as opposed to the 50% related to each other that me and my brother are. So that's also more than the individual females would be if they reproduced their own offspring. So they would be 50% related to their children, but they're 75% related to their sisters. So there's an evolutionary and genetic incentive to forward their sisters rather than their children. And so that's why they kind of do everything for the good of the colony, because they're forwarding their genetics that way as opposed to trying to kind of go rogue and reproduce on their own. But if the colony does go south and the queen dies and they can't get another one, or they can't requeen, female workers can lay drones, because if you remember, drone eggs aren't fertilized. So they can lay drones on their own in kind of a last-ditch attempt to forward their genetics, but that only happens if the queen is really, really bad, and worker ovaries are not developed to the point where they could ever lay female eggs. So it's just queens. So I think that's really cool, and that's the driving force behind why a colony setup like this works, which I think is one of the most interesting things about honeybees. Now, kind of on to why we're worried about them, what the issues are, and what we can do about it. This is the fun part. So I'm sure you all have heard about colony collapse disorder. This is like the big thing in the news, on the Cheerios boxes and everything. And it's always like scientists don't know what's killing the bees, right? Well, so there are a lot of things. There's just a conglomeration of stressors that build up to hurt these bees. And so it's kind of like the idea of if I came up and, hit you, it wouldn't knock you down, but if 10 things did, you probably would fall down. And so that's the same thing with these bees. They're evolved to deal with some of these stressors, but not all of them. And so when they're put through all of these crazy things, they're dying kind of right and left. This is a graph of the bee populations over time. This is 2007, so it's really not that up to date, but you can tell the honeybee decline. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the things that are really the main things contributing to this and kind of the main categories, because there's a lot of different things in these categories. So the first one I want to talk about is Varroa mites. Varroa Destructor are their names, which is, fitting. So these mites reproduce asexually, so they can go into a hole, the comb where the larvae are and that are about to pupate, and they feed on the pupating larvae, and then they can reproduce while they do that, and reproduce males and females, and they can mate with each other and then move out to other cells in the comb and do the same thing to all the other bees. So it's kind of this exponential process that you don't have to have two mites mating with each other. They kind of just bloom out of these holes, and so you have this insane amount of mites in your hive, and these mites feed on the fat bodies of the bees, so it really is detrimental towards the bees' health and their nutrition and productivity going forward, which can definitely bring the hive down. But in addition to that, these mites are also vectors for viruses, the main one being deformed wing virus. This virus causes the bees to emerge with really shriveled up wings, so they can't fly, and obviously if you can't fly, you can't forage. If you can't forage, you don't have food. So it's pretty negative, and these mites are they weren't native to the US because neither are bees, but they were introduced here in 1982, and you can kind of see the drop that the bees took. So they're definitely a big issue, and it's the kind of thing where Monsanto and different companies will work really, really hard to come up with some way to treat these mites, and then as soon as they do, and as soon as they find something that works, it's used for 4 or 5 years, and then the mites become accustomed to it and you can't use it anymore. So it's a whole process, and nobody really knows what to do to get rid of these mites, and every treatment kind of works but doesn't fully work. So it's kind of a mess. Then another thing is just pesticides. Obviously pesticides are kind of an issue, especially when you have big monoculture agriculture like I was talking about, where farmers want to spray all of their crops with pesticides, and you can't spray in the night because how would somebody spraying pesticides figure out how to get home when they're lost in this place in the middle of the night? So they have to spray during the day when all the bees are out foraging, and so the bees get sprayed, the flowers get sprayed, the bees end up eating the pesticides, and it gets in their food sources and their honey, and it's definitely not super detrimental in low amounts, but in high amounts it's not great. And then in combination with all the rest of these things, it's kind of really awful. So the next one is monoculture, like I was talking about. These almond farms can be hundreds of thousands of acres. There's just so many almond bloom or almond flowers. And so if you started eating tomatoes for the rest of your life, you wouldn't be that healthy, even though they're tomatoes. So neither are these bees, even when they're eating something that's healthy for them, if they don't have a varied diet, it starts to get really bad. So just planting wildflower strips, just strips of wildflowers in between these fields would be really helpful to the bees, but that's kind of a lot of work for these farmers. So it's another stressor where the bees are out here and they're foraging on the same floral resource for 3 months. And they get really tired of it. It gets to be nutritionally poor for them. So it's just an added stressor. And then again, I was talking about before, viruses. So there's different pathogens that the bees experience. This one represented here is European foul brood, which is really, really bad for the bees. It basically gets into the larvae and makes them all stretchy and gross and sticky and yellow, and so they are dead and they can't grow. The whole colony just almost immediately dies, and if this happens to you, you have to basically burn all of your frames and just light a fire with your hives in it. So it's really, really detrimental and can take out a lot of hives at a time, and if you don't catch it in time, it can contaminate other hives, and it's just a really, really bad thing. And so then there's a lot of other pathogens along that line. So there's also American foul brood, there's deformed wing virus. So it's just kind of like in each one of these